that I will faithfully and diligently discharge my duties and perform my functions in the high office.
So help me God.
Every year, the ministers pass resolutions that are tabled for adoption by the leaders.
Greetings, and you are watching Beyond the Ballot, a program aimed at providing you with updates and analysis on the latest developments buzzing in the corridors of government and politics. My name is Jackie Shabango, and today we'll be discussing Africa beyond foreign aid. Yes, you heard me. How do we advance the African continent beyond foreign aid? As you may know that, in recent times, hitherto, the buzzing word in the corridors of politics and governments across the African continent has been that of foreign aid being tampered with, especially foreign aid from the United States of America. So today, I'm joined by a panel of experts in the place of international politics and economic development. And after the break, we'll delve deeper into this topic. So sit back. We'll be right back after the break.
Crying, oh, I don't know, Trump has removed money. He said he's not giving us any more money. Watu wanalia. Why are you crying? It's not your government, it's not your country. He has no reason to give you anything. I mean, you don't pay taxes in America. He is appealing to his people. Shauri yenu bwana. This is a wake-up call for you to say, okay, what are we going to do to help ourselves? Instead of crying, to jiulize, what are we going to do? Haya ametoa hiyo pesa, sasa tutafanya namna gani jameni? What are we going to do? Yeah? To support ourselves. Because nobody is going to continue holding out a hand there to give you. It is time for us to use our resources for the right things. We are the ones who are using them for the wrong things.
Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're watching Beyond the Ballot on Love Well Set. This is a platform where we deliberate on issues affecting, people across the African continent and borders beyond, underpinned, of course, by what is happening in the corridors of politics and policies in the government. And like I said before the break, today we are going to be discussing advancing Africa beyond foreign aid. And joining me in studio today, it's two powerful academics and reputable political analysts in their own rights and economists, I think, in your own rights. Gentlemen, welcome to Beyond the Ballot. We have Dr. Mpumlwana for the first time. No, not Mpumlwana. Why am I keep on saying Mpumlwana? It's because I collided with you, with Dr. Mpumlwana at the same time. But we have Dr. Malishu Ngobe, who is a researcher and academic and a lecturer associated with, amongst other institutions, the University of Johannesburg. Mr. Ngobe, welcome to Beyond the Ballot.
Welcome, pleased to meet you, and I would like to say greetings to the viewers and to the listeners.
Yeah, I'm glad to be having you here. I remember we met during the Gauteng launch of the G20 build-up sessions, and you made a commitment that after our conversation that day, you'll be here, and here you are today. So we are very pleased to have you with us today. I'm looking forward to a very robust conversation
Equally,
with you.
Thank you very much as well.
Amazing. And I have next to him my lovely brother, a common feature in this platform, the upcoming doctor, of course, Mr. Mr. David Kabwe, a PhD candidate for international relations, joining us here today to help us discuss this topic at hand.
Thank you for having me.
Gentlemen, it's been quite a very interesting year. I think since the installation or the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States, the issue of foreign aid has been one of the common concerns that has caused a buzz, not only in the corridors of politics, but predominantly there, but also in all corners of society, including civil society. And I know that as academics predominantly, you are also putting your heads to it. And today I just want us to just attempt to look into the possibility of having an independent Africa that is self-reliant and develops without the implications of foreign aid or depending on foreign aid. But before we delve into that discussion, I just want, Dr. Melusi, I just want you to help us to lay some bit of context for the sake of the viewer predominantly concerning this. And I want you to just bring us up to speed on the overall impact of foreign aid. How far have we come with foreign aid as a continent? What necessitated that in the beginning? What has been the implications thereof, and how do you see us navigating without? Just a brief overview of that.
The issue of aid, it's a component part of the business model of the imperial system of the Americas, that is the American government, as a hegemon. So from 1945, when the power of hegemony passed from the British Empire to the Americans, right, the reserve dollar became the reserve currency of the world. So in terms of them dominating and subordinating the world and subordinating Africa, part of that, they dominated us in terms of military and in terms of commerce and economics. So what they get from Africa, they manage to make Africa a warehouse, right? Africa is not allowed to industrialize. And if you think that we have industrialization, that is not. We are not allowed to be a competitor, but we are an open market. Number one, we are a warehouse for resources that goes to the first world, and they are benefited there. Still, we are a resource because we are an open market at prices that are determined by them. Now, America being the reserve, the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world, meaning that's why all central banks in the world, and in Africa particularly, that is subordinated, they have to have forex. That's why when you go out of the country, or when our government wants to buy plant and machinery, they're not interested overseas. They're not interested in the rand. They're not interested in the Zimbabwean dollar. They're not interested in the kwacha or Egyptian currency, because those currencies are not convertible globally. The only currency that is convertible and that is first amongst equals globally is the American dollar. So that's why you find all reserve banks in Africa, they keep strategically forex, and most of that forex is US dollar first, before it's even the British pound or the yen. The most popular is. Now that's why when you can take the US dollar, you can take it anywhere in Africa or anywhere in the world, is as good as gold. That's what reserve currency means. American dollar is as good as gold. So now why they put across the issue of aid as part of a business model is to keep us enslaved. And this is how it works. Whenever they're taking minerals from us, right, and they give us prices that are determined by them. But those prices are within a framework of dependency. They are not competitive prices. Why do I say that? They're not determined by us. They're determined by them. So for us now to be, in order for us to be able to pay for this debt that they are giving us, this so-called aid, they don't want our rent. They don't want our kwacha. We must pay it in American US dollars. If we can't, we pay it in resources first. That's why you find before we do anything else with the monies that we'll have earned from our resources, before we even invest in our public sector, for instance, your health, your education, etc., etc., the first thing you must pay for is to pay for what they call debt servicing. Now, if you do not have that money and they are still processing the money they have to buy for you, they will put forward to you, they have a mechanism of aid, right? So they'll say, oh, no, you can use that aid to pay a little bit for your health for this and that and that and that. That aid is not a grant. It means it still has to be paid back. And you are kept in this vicious cycle. So I'd like to say congratulations. The business model is no more working, because now there is new sheriffs in town. There's Russia, there's China that are challenging the business model of the G7. And the leader of the G7 is America. So now if their business model, because these are ruthless business people, if their business model is not working anymore, why should they keep the aid? Why should anybody be crying, right? For those of us who are serious scholars and we know exactly what is going on, it's long overdue. From when the whole of Africa became, when we move beyond colonialism, because we're now in neo-colonialism, the highest stage of imperialism, we knew this to me was very obvious. It was going to come. So that's why they are pulling out their money from World Health Organization and many other institutions. Even their own kith and kin, you can see they are hitting tariffs on Canada, on anybody else, because this is the elite, because they have to protect the asset base of their prices. So there is no need for them to be giving out aid if you are not going to do exactly as they tell you. And what I mean by exactly, to be completely subjugated, subordinated, and to be saying, yes, master, yes, master. So it's long overdue for me. So to me, I'm not surprised. It's high time Africans must stand on their own 2 feet. And even before this happened, already Thomas Sankara spoke about it when he went to the African Union. He says, we must cut off this aid and not pay it, right? It might sound very aggressive and all that, but it's the right thing to do, because Africa, actually, what they should be demanding and what they should be fighting for, it's a topic for another day. It's reparations. And I'm not talking about once-off payments here. It's I have my ideas on how this reparations should be structured. But this whole idea of aid, it was not aid. No, it was not aid at all. It was monies, as I told you, that were meant to keep our public sector in a minimal sense ongoing. The first ideas, and part of that aid money was also deliberately used to create what they call the middle class. I would like to call it Africa's puppet sellout leadership, right? Because part of our leaders, not all of them, not people like Thomas Sankara or Ibrahim, part of our leaders, they became sellout. If you look at our leaders in Africa today, you look at them, whatever name you want to call them, they will speak revolutionary language. They talk left and they walk right. They live the lifestyle, exactly the lifestyle that is lived by Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Donald Trump. And they keep on telling us things will take time. Whereas education is not free. Anywhere else in Africa, our people are mired in endemic, long-lasting poverty. So you will see them, they have all the trappings of so-called power. All right? Malcolm X used to call them house niggers. Right. Negroes, so they're not field Negroes or else. So it's a good thing that this aid thing has gone. So that we're getting closer and closer to the highest stage of imperialism where we are going to have total confrontation. We'll have confrontation with our leadership in Africa, which is already there. You can see what's happening in the DRC and Sudan, everywhere. And we will have also confrontation at a global level. So it's a multi-pronged type of confrontation that is taking place.
Amazing. Thank you for those thoughts, Dr. Ngcobo. Quite insightful analysis. A tool that was, and I'm paraphrasing now, used to further consolidate the agenda of subjugating an African so that they can, realize invariably their interests at the expense of the people. Kabwe, the underlying effects of this foreign aid over the years. I know that mainstream media would not trumpet that because a large chunk of it is also captured by the same aiders, for lack of a better word. What has been the underlying effects of the foreign aid in Africa for the longest of time?
Right, I appreciate that. And it's quite interesting, the use of the term reparations. The theme of the African Union this year is actually the year of reparations and I find that very, very topical. Now, the underlying nuance that is coming out is the erosion of the Westphalian narrative. Now, if you go back and you look at the Peace of Westphalia, it is largely considered to be the origin of international relations, the way countries work with each other. Before we had countries, we had a series of kingdoms. Kingdoms were not the way we previously thought about them. They were smaller units. There was a king would rule, and they came up with a lot of these rules. A king is sovereign, a king is chosen and selected by God, a historical event happened called the Enlightenment, A shift away from this notion happened. There was a war that was perpetuated among Protestants and Catholics in the church, became known as the 100 Years' War because it lasted for over 3 decades. After this war consolidated, peace was signed, and the notion of what a kingdom is then became challenged. Essentially, kingdoms were phased out, and what we today now know as countries were introduced. Now, the manner in which this was introduced is known as the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia has introduced the nature of the globe as we see it today. Now, the problem with the Peace of Westphalia is how can you conceptualize a global system when you have not actually encapsulated what is happening everywhere in the world? A global system was set up in the absence of what is actually happening in Africa. This kind of nuances were elements such as there must be a clearly defined border, there must be sovereignty, and the way that international relations operates is state-centric. But we are seeing the reality of this, particularly in the African context, is not true. We see a lot of transnational border movements, and a lot of the aid that is required has been aid that has gone for purposes of security, as we've discussed in previous iterations of this conversation. Now, the result of that has been the nature and the makeup of the world today is not the way it had been initially conceptualized when the Peace of Westphalia was signed. Therefore, what we are seeing is an erosion of the entire kind of global concept. I like to identify as a post-structuralist in the loosest sense. I won't get into the nitty-gritties of the theoretical elements there, but essentially, structuralism is the view that the world operates according to a structure. The elites in that structure determine how the globe itself functions. Now, post means after, so post-structuralism is the view that the elites in that structure can change. The shift away from the Westphalian narrative demonstrates that we are seeing a global shift away from what has been traditionally defined as how the world should operate. And the aid conversation is a very clear demonstrator of this. Another very important point that I'll make, and this will be my last point on the topic, has been, if you read the executive order that was signed, that spoke particularly in the context of South Africa, it is endemic of wider conversations that have been happening, such as, the initial silence of the Trump administration on issues such as AGOA. What we have seen is there were 2 points that were referenced in that executive order. Number one was the judgment from Israel and Palestine by the International Criminal Court. Number two was South Africa's relationship with Iran. Now, essentially, what has been the core element of the Trump administration has been a shift away from multilateralism. As the doctor has mentioned, a lot of our multilateral organizations no longer have the same relationship with the U.S. They are pulling out because, as you've mentioned, the benefit of the U.S. is no longer what it was previously. This shift towards bilateralism is marked by a distinct move to consolidate and increase power. South Africa took Israel to the court. South Africa was successful in this effort. It is now globally recognized as a attempted genocide. Now, you can imagine if you were the biggest funder and the biggest supporter of this effort, it's a global embarrassment because you are now seen as complicit in actions that were directly contributed to a perceived genocide. That's one. Number two, you recall that Iran was previously a potential nuclear power. One of the hallmarks of the Obama administration, besides the Affordable Care Act, was the nuclear negotiation with Iran in particular. Because South Africa has not aligned in the notion of what a shared enemy is, we have seen that the entire notion of aid, this conversation, is actually just a massive red herring to distract from the actual matter which is at hand. And I like the framing that you used, and I'll jump onto what my colleague has mentioned, that it is indeed a form of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism in the highest order, and we see that in the neoliberal context in which we are operating today.
I think you further cemented what Dr. Mncube was saying. But what I wanted you to really speak about, I think now I'm putting you on the spotlight. I'm not sure that you deliberately avoided to answer my question. You missed my question right there. I'm talking about the underlying effect in the most simple terms of this aid. We need to expose the shortfalls of this aid beyond the pervasive narrative that has been perpetuated or trumpeted, whatever word you want to use there, by the mainstream media. It has been said that we need aid, and this is the narrative of the mainstream media, and we know who controls the narrative behind the scenes and beyond the editor-in-chief. It's the people who fund it, and the people who fund it often are of the same system, the handlers of the same system. But I want us to look into the impact of the aid, to say, has it really benefited the poor of the poorest, the people that it was meant for? Because the people whom are now, who seem to be used as billboards, for lack of a better word, placards of necessitating or advocating for the return of the aid, if that's what our leaders are looking for in these attempts of trying to renegotiate with the United States, amongst other things. Did these people, the so-called vulnerable and the poor of the poorest, benefit from these aids, or these aids were just used to empower our greedy, visionless, and lazy leaders?
Look, imperialism is very deceptive.
Yeah.
Devilishly clever, very deceptive. So they will tell you this is aid for Africa to help Africans.
Yeah.
But primarily when you deconstruct aid, and I'm giving you my own argument, it was there to reinforce the system of patronage. The system of patronage that is actually building a black middle class, or Africa's middle class, and to reinforce ongoing elitism amongst Africans. That is simply corruption. It never benefited the people on the ground. It was not meant to. How do you benefit the people on the ground, right? First and foremost, if you are a serious leader like Thomas Sankara, like Che Guevara, like Castro, like Chrysan, or any other leader, not some of the leaders we have now, except for, I would say, Ibrahim Traore, you have to study the system, how the global economic system works and how it has been dominated, and I've explained to you the issue of the US reserve currency. Yeah. Now, when you benefit your people, you don't benefit and perpetuate a system that benefits your people peripherally. That's not why we fought our revolution, or our ancestors fought slavery, colonialism, and they keep on fighting neo-colonialism. May their souls rest in peace. We want to upend and to overhaul the whole structural system. The aid was never about overhauling the structural system. Yeah. He will go further into that and explain. Yeah. It was never about that. Yeah. It was there about the periphery, and to have gatekeepers who are our leaders to make sure that they do not revolt. Right? They have money, they have monies in Switzerland, they have monies in America, they have monies in France. It was not. So how can you say this aid benefited people if you're a serious revolutionary, if you're a serious scholar? Because we are about deconstructing, and when we deconstruct and overhaul, we mean structurally. I'll give you an example. You saw what Ibrahim Traore did when he took over. The whole idea was to structurally change the price of uranium. Yeah. There was a difference what the French were giving him a pittance and what he is getting now. And look at what he's doing to the commanding heights of the economy by empowering. That's why every time they're trying to assassinate him every month. Here in South Africa, we haven't done it. The structural levers. What do I mean by structural levers? Let's take South Africa, for instance. We're talking about the land. Yeah. And land is not just farming. Land is everything you can imagine, because you can't even imagine if you don't have land. It's everything, right? You're talking about the land, you're talking about the mines, you're talking about the manufacturing, setting up your price, looking for your own markets, putting intellectual property on your goods and services. Yeah. That is all structural. And that must be owned in our country, in our continent, by melanated black people. And we do not have to be apologetic about that, right? So why are we doing this expropriation without compensation? Because we know there was a historical injustice. And the United Nations, when we were not there, when it was being formed anyway, even pronounced that apartheid was against humanity. It was a crime against humanity. Yeah. So we haven't resolved that issue. even in Zimbabwe, it's not totally resolved because when they tried to do it, sanctions were put on them. And to show the brotherhood of white supremacy, the people who colonized Zimbabwe were the British, but the people who effected the Zimbabwe Democracy Act, it was not even the British, it was the Americans, after consultations among them. And the effect of that is that Zimbabwe could not access foreign currency in global markets. Remember, they are denominated in the US reserve currency. They could not even access letters of credit, etc., etc., etc. They could not do that structurally. So even if you have a farm and it doesn't rain, what good is your farm? Even if you have farms and you do not have capital, and I'm not talking now plant machinery, I'm talking for capital money to buy that plant of machinery, what does that happen? So Donald Trump is not stupid. He's a seasoned, ruthless businessman. Even what they've concocted with Elon Musk, the land that they took, hence they came with constitutionalism under the Roman Dutch law. The land that they took from the whole of Africa is that it will be protected by private property, constitutionalism, rule of law. Okay, rule of law. Where did you get this land from? From whom did you take it?
Why is it that after receiving more than $1.4 trillion in foreign aid, Africa is still incredibly poor? This continent has received more foreign aid than any other place in the world. But what exactly do they have to show for all of this money? Sadly, it turns out that 350 million Africans still don't have clean water. 43% of the continent is still without electricity, and the number of people living on less than $2 a day has actually grown from 280 million in 1990 to more than 430 million people today. Even more bizarre is the fact that the rest of the world seems to be leaving Africa behind. While the number of people in Africa living in absolute poverty has grown over the last 30 years, that number has fallen dramatically across the rest of the world. It used to be 1.9 billion people living in such poverty in 1990, and now it's dropped to 736 million today. So the question remains, why does Africa still look like this, even after more than $1 trillion has been thrown at the continent over the last 7 decades? According to one report from the World Bank, an astonishing 75% of foreign aid projects designed to improve Africa's agricultural industry were failures. And some programs actually made the situation worse. In the 1970s, Operation Milis Mopti aimed to boost grain production in Mali, but instead resulted in a government-imposed pricing system that triggered an 80% collapse in production. In Senegal, one foreign aid program spent $4 million to increase the number of cattle in the country's Bakel department from 11,000 to 25,000. Instead, the number of livestock only grew by 900. And these are just a couple examples of hundreds of billions of dollars spent on foreign aid projects over the last several decades. In fact, the failure of African foreign aid programs has become so apparent that YouTubers now have a much better track record of delivering on results instead of government agencies. Once more, other countries, which were also former colonies themselves, have received little to no foreign aid, but are actually doing much better than their African counterparts. Take Singapore and Senegal as examples. Both were former colonies that gained independence in the 1960s. Today, Singapore has surpassed its former colonizer in wealth despite existing on a tiny island with virtually no natural resources. In contrast to this vast wealth, Senegal remains one of the most impoverished nations on earth despite receiving billions in foreign aid since its independence. The stark contrast raises a crucial question. What did Singapore do so differently that led it to become so much richer than Senegal? Well, not becoming a socialist dictatorship probably helped, because at the same time that nations like Singapore embraced free market principles, at one point, 20 nations across Africa identified as Marxist-Leninist or socialist states. These governments spent decades exerting extensive control over their economies, hindering growth, and driving a cycle of poverty that exists to this day. Ultimately, the people of Africa are not poor because they lack natural resources or don't have enough foreign aid. It's because their governments chose policies that kept them poor. More than 30 years after the collapse of Africa's Marxist bloc, many countries across the continent continue to democratically pursue the exact same authoritarian policies that kept their nations in poverty. These governments continue to centrally plan their economies and the lives of their citizens, restricting the ability of Africans to creatively problem solve, trade goods and services between each other freely, and pursue prosperity independent of the whims of a corrupt elite political class that rules over them. But what does any of that have to do with foreign aid? Well, it's actually twofold. By propping up failing governments, you allow the people creating the problem the ability to stay in power, since they are often the ones helping to control how aid is distributed. And two, random infusions of foreign cash and goods can make it incredibly difficult for local entrepreneurs to develop domestic industries. In short, far from helping, foreign aid is in many cases exacerbating the problem, as Africans desperately trying to climb out of poverty are constantly knocked down by their own governments with the help of foreign dollars.
So I hope I've expanded when you want to know what has this aid done for us. It hasn't done anything for us. Actually, that aid, it was money bought by using our Africa's leaders to say, keep quiet, right? Keep quiet, be a good boy, stay in your place, stay on the periphery while we run the show. Right? So it has done nothing, totally nothing, but it has fattened the pockets of Africa's puppet sellout leadership. That's why you see their children go to private schools, they go to France, they go to Europe, they go to America, they drive the latest car. But when it comes to getting our NEFSAS money on time for our children, year after year, our children have to be doing for that money. When it comes to creating jobs for our people, they give our people a pittance of 350. You understand? But you look at all of Africa's leaders, you can name them. You can name them. All of them live a billionaire's life, and I can bet my pound, none of them, most of their strategic assets, most of their monies are in France, Europe, Switzerland, and all that. So that's how they've diversified their portfolio. And how have Africans benefited, right? So the lifestyle of our leaders doesn't match the majority of black people. So this aid has been peripheral, my brother. It has benefited not the majority of black people. It has never, not even one day.
Amazing. You've made your point of getting it succinctly. The latest development, just to digress also as you jump in, I want you to just briefly elucidate us on the issue of UK's mediation involvement between the US and Ukraine on the 30 days ceasefire, and what does this mean in relation to what Dr. Ngobe has said?
Okay, I appreciate that. That's actually quite a good segue, and I'm grateful that you've teed it up that way. Now, what was very interesting is the manner in which initial negotiations were very much disrupted had to do with a Munich conference that the Vice President of the United States attended alongside the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. And in this particular context, they began to speak indirectly about negotiations that the US had with Russia. Now, this became quite odd for the international community in that it seemed that a number of agreements were parlayed in the absence of the Ukraine itself. Now, we all saw the exchange that happened in the White House between Zelensky and Trump, and we all saw the fallout.
I mean, I sit on a number of charities, on the board of a number of charities, that are doing fantastic work in Africa. And I'll come into details in a moment. But I think what's really important to stress here, again, is what these charities can and cannot do. So the charities that I sit on are able to go into these countries and actually provide band-aid solutions, intermediate solutions. They cannot provide jobs, which is where it's really important for us to see much more involvement in the private sector. And that's why I'm talking about this other form of aid and why it's hampered that opportunity. Some of the charities that I think are doing some fantastic work are places like Room to Read, which has got very targeted programs towards helping young people get access to books. Other charities, for example, I sit on the board of a charity called Lundin for Africa, which is a very, very clearly defined mandate to try and support through lending projects in microfinance across the continent. And the third charity that I work for, I'm a patron, for whom I'm a patron, is called ARC, Absolute Return for Kids. Again, very targeted involvement, providing antiretrovirals to Africans across Africa. But again, very narrow, and also no illusion that they are going to be providing long-term sustainable growth to these countries. So there's some examples of some interesting programs. Well, to the extent that we know we're not going to achieve those goals, which is obvious. 2015 is around the corner. The architects of the Millennium Development Goals are themselves going around saying that, Africa is likely not to meet any of those goals. So I think those type of very sort of large, big scale, large focus, lofty goals tend to me to be red herrings for the fundamental issues. What I'm looking to see is much more active programs to implement the things that we know work, the things that have made China, and India and South Africa and Botswana successful at creating jobs and reducing poverty. That's what we need to focus our efforts on. I think it's also important that we focus on spinning a more positive story about Africa. Too many of the NGOs and celebrities and charities around are very focused on perpetuating a negative stereotype about the continent, which cannot be helpful to raise the very young Africans that are coming up across the continent. That is of no value to be negative, and yet that's what we see across the continent. So I think we just need to do more of what we know works and less of what we know does not work. In fact, there is no country on earth today that has achieved economic development and reduced poverty by relying on aid. Not a single one. And yet we're pushing a product that we know doesn't work at a time when we know what does work. And that's what the issue is here. Absolutely. Microfinance is one of the tools for development that I talk about in the book. It's an amazing, amazing way of providing support to Africans and people all around the world to finance themselves and therefore be able to stand on their own 2 feet. They can provide themselves with an income, provide education and healthcare to their children. There are numerous examples of this. Mohammed Yunus won the Nobel Prize for Grameen Bank, and I just was on a discussion program with him not too long ago. Even in this market, he's, with all the challenges of the capital markets right now, he's managed to raise $1 billion from the very small the very small communities within Bangladesh. It's $1 billion in rural Bangladesh, and very, very low default rates and tremendous success. These are the type of programs that should be coming out of the multilateral institutions, and they're not. We're seeing more of the same, giving more money to African governments, giving more money to governments around the world. Whereas it seems to me, we know what works. And Kiva is another example I talk about in the book. It's an internet interface for minimum of $25. You can lend to an entrepreneur anywhere around the world, again, helping to finance a job. And again, lending is the operative word, gives an opportunity for Africans on the ground to actually meaningfully change their lives.
As a buffer towards Russia, the assistance to Ukraine is not for the purposes of assisting Ukraine, it is for the purposes of ensuring that there is no expansion on the side of Russia. So what we see is whether it's the US or wider allies within the NATO sphere and within the European Union, the assistance as it pertains to development within the Ukrainian context is one that is rooted in self-interest. And this is how it ties back to the point that the doctor was making. Aid is not an altruistic activity. And the best way you can see this is aid is often given to governments. Anyone who studies economics will know if you want to develop an economy, you do not give money to the government. One needs to invest in business interests.
Absolutely.
If one is not invested in business interests, there can be no growth. But the reason why this is because when you invest in a particular government, it increases the GDP. It does not touch the Gini coefficient. It does not touch the Human Development Index, and it perpetuates the cyclical nature that exists of dependency in the structure that the doctor was mentioning.
Those are the effects that I wanted you to speak about.
Yes.
Probably you're trying to navigate on how are you going to deal with this without offending your political principle, I suppose. But with that being said, gentlemen, we'll go on a short break where we'll get, I suppose, some thoughts around the world concerning aid.
World leaders from rich countries really want to solve global inequality, right? Wrong. If you listen to them, you'd think they do.
Inequality is exploding.
The United States is the world's largest giver in the world by far of foreign aid.
Rich governments do give more than $130 billion in aid each year to poor countries. But the truth is, the aid narrative is a lie. It hides the brutal reality about how the global economy actually works. I was born in Eswatini, a small country in southern Africa, and I studied in the US. I spent much of my life analyzing global inequality. Global inequality describes the income gap between rich countries, sometimes referred to as the global north, and the poorer regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often referred to as the global south. It's a huge gap. Now, we all know that during the colonial period, the global north plundered the south for its own enrichment: gold, silver, land, slaves, and labor, generating a huge income gap between north and south. Now that the colonial era is over, you'd think the gap is closing. But guess what? It's not. In fact, today, it's 4 times bigger than it was in the 1950s. So why is inequality increasing if so-called generous rich countries give so much aid? It's because they give aid with one hand, taking much more with the other. Let's break it down. Each year, about $2 trillion flows from the global north to the global south. That's aid, loans, foreign investments, everything. But you know what? $5 trillion actually flows back in the opposite direction, from the global south to the global north. That means that the north takes a net total of $3 trillion from the south every year. That's 24 times the aid budget that the south receives. It's a huge transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries. How is this happening? First, through often shady financial activities, from tax evasion and illicit money transfers involving big multinational companies, to interest payments on debts that have already been paid off many times over. Second, through international trade rules designed to benefit rich countries, allowing them to extract labor and resources from poor countries at artificially low prices. The consequences are mind-blowing. Get this, the people of the global south contribute most of the labor and the resources that go into the world economy. But the poorest 60% of humanity receives only 5% of all of the new income that's generated by global economic growth each year. The rest goes straight to the already rich. Sounds complex and totally unfair, right? The point is, rich nations grow rich at the expense of the rest of the world. So what makes this possible in the first place? Power imbalances. Basically, richer nations of the global north, I'm talking the US, UK, Germany, and France, but also Canada, Australia, Japan, and others, get to control international trade in their own interests. Take the World Trade Organization, for example, which sets the rules of international trade. Technically, it's one nation, one vote. But in reality, rich nations have all of the bargaining power. It's like a monopoly. The same rich countries also have almost all of the voting power at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. At the IMF, the US alone has 16% of the votes and veto power over all major decisions. But all of the countries of the Global South combined, home to about 85% of the world's population, have less than 50% of the votes. In other words, people in developing countries have only about 1/10 of the votes that people in rich countries have on a per capita basis. It's a huge and even racist imbalance, kind of like a global apartheid right at the heart of our international institutions. Rich nations have leveraged this power to prevent poor nations from using progressive policies like tariffs and subsidies to develop their own industries. And the irony is, those are the very same policies that rich nations themselves once used for their own growth. Historically, it hasn't always been this way. During the colonial period, the Global South was forced to serve as a source of raw materials, slaves, and cheap labor for the North. But by the 1950s, poor countries had freed themselves from colonialism. They were electing their own leaders, introducing land reforms, social spending, and subsidies for their domestic industries. And it worked. It was a development miracle for the South.
This decade is the decade of African independence.
Now, you might think that major powers would be happy about this. After all, they claim to be all for development. Wrong again. They were not happy. The rich North was losing access to the cheap labor and precious resources they'd enjoyed under colonialism. So they intervened. And by the 1980s, they had reimposed the old colonial logic on the global South. So, how did they do it? First of all, with coups in Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, and so on. They toppled democratic leaders and replaced them with dictators that would serve their economic interests. Then, by leveraging their power as creditors, to force global South countries to reverse their progressive reforms, basically kicking away the ladder to development. The aid narrative obscures the truth. Aid is actually flowing in reverse. Rich countries aren't developing poor countries. It's poor countries that are developing rich ones. Colonialism never ended. It just changed form. But it doesn't have to be this way. Inequality is not a natural fact. It's an artifact, a consequence of power. We need to reverse the assumption that aid is the solution and change the rules of the game to make the global economy fairer for the world's majority, so they have a real say in the decisions that affect them. Want real solutions? Democratize global governance to give the South a fair share of voting power. Cancel old debts. End illicit financial flows and resource thefts. Allow poor countries to use subsidies and tariffs to develop their own economies. And set a global minimum wage so that workers in the South receive a fair share of the value they produce. Poor countries don't need charity, they need justice.
Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're still watching Beyond the Ballot on Love World Set. And for those who have joined us now, we are talking advancing Africa beyond foreign aid. What will it take for us to navigate throughout that systematic imprisonment of the mind, first and foremost. And we are having this conversation with powerful analysts and academics, and we wish to hear from you, your thoughts concerning the subject at discussion right now. What are your thoughts? Is it about time that we move post-foreign aid? Is the discussion about foreign aid in the corridors of politics still relevant in how it's taking form and shape right now, or should it take a different direction altogether? Maybe discussions on how we probably leverage what is within to can bail out ourselves, in the simplest terms, from that structural trap that has only benefited, according to the analysis here, the leaders of our respective countries. Gentlemen, we spoke just before the break we tried to analyze what the foreign aid has been to us and its effects, or rather the impact thereof, the cumulative impact of the foreign aid across the African continent. And from what I've picked up is that there is a consensus from both of you in your respective analysis that it was about time. It is about time, rather, as Dr. Mngcobo has said, that we rid ourselves out of the aid as Africans. And I'm interpreting that as a blessing in disguise, that has just collided with us. And like you've said also, that it has done no good for those it has said to be targeted at, which is the poor and the ordinary people on the grounds. I think even the so-called middle class, it has not assisted them in any ways. If you come into South Africa and you look at the middle class in this day and age, even the balance sheet does not connote that of a middle class in the context of the Western world, which they find themselves inadvertently subscribing to, and being capable, or rather diligent stewards of the agenda in whatever corner they find themselves in for 8 hours each and every day. But I just want us to go right into the objective of the discussion, and I hope in the next 20 minutes we'll be able to exhaust the deliberations around that. And in this segment, I want us to look into the bottlenecks that have captured us into this aid, and how can we really move out of that as the African continent? What are these bottlenecks that have captured us there and at the same time suffocating Africa's potential to grow and to be independent, amongst other things? I think you'd want to go first.
Look, imperialism over Africa has always carried a very heavy stick. They use a stick and carrot, but their stick is very, very powerful, and they've used it. For instance, if you look at the military of the imperialists, let alone America's budget, which is almost $1 trillion they use on their army and all that, they can project a war on anybody in the world. Africa, they don't even consider it. Africa is not even a serious player. But that is part of the reason why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was set up. The North Treaty, NATO was set up to be, amongst other things, besides their protection of Europe and their white supremacy civilization, was to be a policeman in Africa, that nobody gets out of hand. It moved hand in hand with the proxy wars that were being engendered by CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. We were having a conversation. He was asking me of a conceptual framework I used in my PhD.
Yeah.
And I said, because the world has become so asymmetric, you cannot have a conventional type of theory you use when you're articulating yourself, especially when you're a revolutionary. But coming back to your point is, one of the ways they've allowed Africa to be subjugated is proxy wars. There's serious proxy wars that have never stopped from after Second World War to date. Actually, from now on, they're going to ratchet them up. That's why you see what is happening in the DRC, Sudan. I would love you to invite people from Sudan, so that people also speak strongly about Sudan. Yeah. Sudan is not, it's a stalemate, it's a failed state.
For a very long time.
And CIA is very involved. CIA, Mossad, and British intelligence are very involved in what is happening in Sudan. And I would like to say, to draw up a prognosis that I see certain signals that are coming into South Africa by the CIA. And when I say CIA, I'm speaking about all Western intelligence. They are declining. Europe is in a recession, I would argue. They can say otherwise, but I have my own decolonized type of perception how I see things.
Yeah.
Europe is definitely in a recession, and America is in a recession. They might say we are not and all that. American economy has been militarized. It cannot compete on a purchasing power parity with China and Russia put together. Even alone with China, it cannot, right? Because they have a debt of about 37 to 40 trillion. They don't have a manufacturing base.
I read this morning an article from a number of sources that, speaks about President Tshisekedi's attempt to mediate, in my own understanding, the proxy war that is happening between the M23 rebels and the people in Congo. Your thoughts about it? Is he going to win? Yes or no?
Yes, in this context, the reason why I would agree with that is because the nature of the engagements that are happening with the U.S. at this stage is very much rooted in ensuring that the U.S. receives resources. The U.S. And the DRC are currently in various conversations. And in all of those conversations, what has been made very clear by the current administration is that they are willing to cede resources and assistance for assistance. And you may recall that the M23 rebels, ever since they took over Goma, were engaged in a lot of illicit mining activities, which created a direct channel for minerals, goods, and resources to go to the Rwandan government. Resources are the name of the game, and this is the avenue that is being explored to ensure that the support that the Tshisekedi administration receives from the U.S. has a full financial backing.
We got that, but how now do we intercept these bottlenecks, in italics? How do we intercept this kind of a behavior? How do we suffocate these bottlenecks? He spoke about proxy wars, tariffs. For me, the underlying issue here is the mental structure, the predominant mental makeup of our leaders. That's the predominant underlying issue here. Because if we do not have leaders who are thinking right, we cannot have a continent that is functioning right.
I can suggest?
Yeah.
Yes, I just want to jump on that quickly. So essentially, to address these bottlenecks, there are 3 facsimiles that need to be considered. The very first facsimile is the nature of aid in itself. Now, when we speak about aid, we're speaking about aid as a developmental component. When we look at aid within a developmental context, what becomes very clear is that aid is often and always rooted in matters of agreements. The most prevalent example of this are structural agreements. Therefore, in order to address these, one first needs to create an industrial capacity. In order to do so, one needs to get out of the nature of structural adjustment programs that have been had. What's interesting about the South African context is South Africa is one of the few African states that did not engage in structural adjustment programs with Bretton Woods institutions. It is one of the reasons why one of our biggest trading partners is China, because they have an economic policy that is rooted in non-interventionalism, meaning they can intervene economically, but there are no political interventions. Agreements of that nature, while they come with their caveats, do serve as alternatives that could be explored in this particular instance. And in this regard, it then becomes very important to zoom into these interventions to ensure that the overall dependency that we have is one that allows us to come out of a nature where we are unable to create tertiary goods. One of our biggest issues on the African continent is the capacity to produce primary and secondary goods, but the inability to produce tertiary goods because of our lack of infrastructural growth and development. So in short, address a lot of these global agreements, particularly those that we have made with Bretton Woods institutions. That is one of the strongest forms to address these bottlenecks.
Yeah, you spoke about infrastructure development and capacity. I think also in the context of South Africa, many foreign investors, and I know probably Dr. Mngwe would want to dispute that because he interrogates almost everything that comes and is underpinned by Western construct. But there's an issue of lack of human capital where critical skills for industrialization is concerned, of which I think that should be something that we look into as part of our pragmatic efforts to, quote unquote, unbundle ourselves from this structural suffocation of foreign aid. But you wanted to say something about how do we navigate through the bottlenecks?
Absolutely.
How do we intercept them?
The standpoint that we must take as Africans and the standpoint that we must take as South Africa, I will use South Africa as a case study. My advice I want to give to the youth of South Africa is this: they must think about it very seriously. Probably they're already doing it. If they're doing it, I want to reinforce it. To the youth of EFF, ANC, MK, PAC, AZAPO, and IFP, you must be seamless and you must seriously focus on the manifestos of all your parties, because there is something general, there's a common thread that runs there to get the commanding heights structurally back to the black body, back to black people unapologetically. That includes the land.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about all those parties. So number 2, the youth. Electioneering will not bring about a revolution. It could be one of the parts, but I would argue equally so, it can mislead you. It's a garden way path that misleads you, elections, because it gets a few into parliament and they live a life of luxury. But revolutionarily, it doesn't change anything. So I'm appealing to the youth of this country so that it's a template for the rest of Africa. Come together. Don't let these old people, don't be stitched into their grudges they have. Be revolutionary minded, come together and make sure that all levers of power and economy, you are involved there. And they must not dare tell you that you cannot sit there. And what are those levers of power am I talking to? Having named the youth, you must make certain that you sit in the Reserve Bank. You must make certain that you sit in all the commercial banks. You must make certain you sit in all the mining houses. You must make certain that you sit in the Public Investment Commission, where there's about 2.5 trillion rands and all that. And what you don't know, you will learn, so that every pathway of money that is made in this country, you are there and you are involved. The future of this country as the black youth, and I've named it across all the parties, it is in your hand, not in the old people who are above their 80s and they're already exiting. Yeah. You have to be revolutionary, like Traore is being revolutionary, like Thomas Sankara is being revolutionary.
Thank you. I know that you've got a lot to say, but unfortunately, because of time, we have to bring this conversation to a close. Probably we'll have a second part of this very soon and look into our inward capabilities in as far as the strength of our sovereign wealth funds, our remittances are concerned in taking Africa forward beyond foreign aid. So till the next discussion here on Beyond the Ballot, stay tuned to Level Set. God bless you.